Hello, everyone. So I get a lot of questions as I lecture, and one question I've received many times in all my years of teaching, especially in my Middle East class, but in other courses I teach as well, my early Western Civ, my modern Western Civ, is why the Jews? Why have the Jewish people throughout history faced, more persecution than any other group? And, it's a very important question, obviously, to understand the history and the origins of it all, and also, another question I get a lot is Zionism. And what does Zionism mean? And how is anti Zionism a new form of anti Semitism? So they do kind of relate these two questions. So I'm going to kind of do this in a couple lectures. This first one is just kind of giving you examples of where and why people have, drawn these Jew hating ideas from. Where does this come from? And of course, it's important to know that there have been many examples of Jew hatred throughout the years. And I think it's also just as before I go any further, when you see the word anti-Semitism, just semantics some people like to play is technically, Semitic is a language root, right? Root. So can you be non-Jewish and be Semitic? Yes. So when you say anti-Semitic, right, are you referring to Jewish people? Historically, generally, when you say anti-Semitism, it's about Jewish people. And so some people like to play games with words and say, well, what do you mean by anti-Semitism? Is it about Jewish people? Well, in this context, yes. For people who sometimes aren't clear, then you could just say I'm talking about hatred towards Jews, and that's what this little lecture is about. So I'm going to do this in a couple lectures I mentioned. So, in terms of the history of the persecution of the Jewish people, it goes back a long time, right? Judaism has been around for thousands of years, and there was a time when the Jewish people thrived, and they had Solomon's temple, and then that temple was destroyed. And then over the years, different civilizations entered the land of the Jewish people, and Jewish people faced persecutions. From the Roman time periods, you had this is the Arch of Titus, which reflects, one of the many times where the Jewish people were assaulted. You had other time periods in history, like in the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, you had the Black Death. And right after the Black Death, around 1348, there was the Strasbourg Massacre, where Jews were rounded up and killed because they were accused of causing the bubonic plague. You had things like the Spanish Inquisition. You had the Russian pogroms in the 1800s. Of course, most infamously of all the Jew-hating attacks was of course the Holocaust, right? And we're 6 million, a third of the Jewish population in the world, probably over a third of the Jewish population in the world was massacred. And then you have much lesser known examples of attacks against Jewish people, like the Farud massacre in modern day Iraq in 1941, around the same time period, obviously, as World War II. There were Jews being rounded up in Iraq, and hundreds of them, and they were massacred as well. And so all the way until today, there's still different forms of Jew hatred, and this is why I do want to kind of get into the next thing, a little bit about how anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism as well, because that's kind of a more modern form of Jew hatred, which I'm going to explain in the next video. So where does it come from? Well, let's look at a few things. So this is the land of the Jewish people, Israel, Judea. This is where their culture and their history started. And do remember this map. It's a pretty good example of the real estate that the Jewish people had. But if you also are familiar with modern day Israel is actually smaller than this piece of real estate that the Jewish people developed back around. This map is from about 1100 BC. And the Jewish people lived in this land, they thrived in this land, and then you had the Assyrians come in, the Babylonians come in, and then of course later on the Romans around 130-ish AD, Roman Emperor Hadrian did tremendous damage to the Jewish people, and many of the Jewish people were forced out of this land. There will always be a Jewish presence in this land, but what will also happen as a result of all these other civilizations coming in and pushing the Jewish people out is the Jewish people become scattered in the Middle East, in Europe, and they become, a people without a home, right, for centuries and centuries and centuries until 1948 when Israel is able to be recreated again. So there's a long time period that the Jewish people don't have a homeland. And I have several lectures talking about, I have a whole lecture I do on the Roman period in Judea, and I go through a lot of the details of what happened to this land. And, in my Middle East class, I have several lectures on the whole rebirth of the modern state of Israel. But this is something that is more other topics that go into a lot more detail. But just at the most basic level, this is what's happened in this land. So one thing that happens as the Jewish people are first living in Judea and then scattered is Judaism. One of the reasons you get anti-Semitism, I would say, from the studies and the reading I've done and studying all the historical things, is monotheism, and connected with that are things like Ten Commandments and other moral obligations. And you say, well, why would that cause Jew hatred? Well, in terms of monotheism, that was a big problem for the Roman world because the Roman, especially during the Roman Empire, if you're a monotheistic person, your top authority in life is God, and it therefore cannot be the Roman emperor. So obviously that's going to rub the Roman Empire the wrong way. And then in terms of obligations, there's a lot of things. If you read the Old Testament, do this, don't do that, that's right, that's wrong. And there's this moral code of behavior. And, people don't like being told what to do. And I think there's at least some element of that in Jew hatred that we've seen over the centuries and millenniums. I don't know if it's the major reason. I don't know if any of these are the major reasons of why it happens, but these are different things that have happened that I think may have influenced some, anti-Semitic attacks and beliefs and attacks against Jewish people. So maybe that very nature of monotheism. Now, of course, Christianity and Islam are monotheistic religions as well. And of course, Christianity also faced similar onslaughts by the Romans. So there's, I think, some credibility to this idea of monotheism being, at least in part, one of the factors of anti-Semitism. Another important issue is this concept of blood libel. Now, this comes up more in the Middle Ages, and it's the false idea that Jews rounded up Christians, especially children, and used their blood for rituals. And as I said, this kind of dates back to the Middle Ages. There's, of course, no evidence of that, but these were stories that were passed in the Middle Ages and often led to a lot of the anti-Semitic attacks in the Middle Ages that I had already mentioned. Connected with that is, of course, this other idea that people were blaming the Jews for the death of Christ. This is, of course, again, not accurate, but people believe it. It took a long time for the Catholic Church to acknowledge it wasn't accurate. In the 1960s, you had the Second Vatican Council, which acknowledged, no, the Jews were not at fault for the death of Christ, but there are still people to this day who believe that. And so I think that has led to some attacks on Jewish people over the centuries, again, more so in the Middle Age period. Other factors that contribute to the negative stereotypes Jewish people have to do with money, right? And, very often when people want to put the negative stereotype, oh, the Jews are the money lenders, they control money, they control the world, all this crazy talk. Where does that come from? Well, again, in the Middle Ages in Europe, there was strong restrictions against Jewish people. Jewish people cannot own land. Jewish people cannot hold public offices. Remember, there are people without a state. There is no land of Israel for them to control. Other civilizations are controlling their homeland during this time period. And so, Jews were forced to turn to other industries, very often money lending, trade. And the reason Jewish people did move into these industries, especially in the Middle Ages, is because one of the concept of usury. Usury means loaning money on interest. And in the Middle Ages, the church said no usury. So, obviously, if there's no usury, then and you're a Christian in the Middle Ages, you're not going to open up a bank. How does a bank work? You're not going to open up a bank if you can't charge people interest. There isn't that element of forbidden usury in Judaism, so Jewish people, opened up banks. And so, yes, they made money from their banking industry, but then all the negative stereotypes developed from there that Jews control the money and they run the world based on it. And again, there's no examples of that at all, right? These are just kind of the lies that people have told. But again, the irony is it was all forced upon the Jewish people because of the restrictions they faced being able to do any other professions. Of course, if you study Jewish people today, Jewish people, yes, of course, there's some Jewish people in economics, but Jewish people are in science and medicine and in arts and lots in arts and music and a lot of different areas. But that's again the negative stereotype. A few other factors that I've kind of seen studying this history over the century, over the years I've studied various things, is the chosen people idea. This has rubbed people the wrong way. And what is that about? Well, in Jewish teachings, there's the concept of the Jews as the chosen people. Now, people then take that idea and they don't understand it. And they go, oh, that means Jewish people think they're better than everybody else. No, that's not true at all. The idea of Jewish being the chosen people, it's more of a kind of a bond with this monotheistic God idea, right? Remember, from Judaism, you get Christianity and Islam. Both of those other religions come off of Judaism. And it's more of an idea of a closeness to God, an idea of obligation to do, and follow the ideas of the religious teachings. It's in no way saying, we're better or Jewish people are better because we're Jewish. That's not what chosen people means. But that's how people have interpreted it. I think another factor that often doesn't get discussed, this is something that I don't know if this next one I've read anywhere or just things I've kind of picked up on my own. A lot of these other ideas are ones that have been well documented. People have done a lot of research on them. But I think this concept of Jewish people is always a small population, right? There are to give you perspective, about 2 billion, more than 2 billion Christians in the world, if you take all the denominations. There are over 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. Jewish people, there's less than 20 million Jewish people in the entire world today. And again, until 1948, the Jewish people didn't even have a homeland that was theirs, that was autonomous. There were, again, Jewish people living in Israel, Judea, but other powers controlled it, and Jewish people were spread out all over the place. So they're always kind of a minority group, a small group, and it's easy to pick on when you're a small group. Another factor that doesn't get discussed often, but I think is definitely an element of Jew hatred, is envy, and that's just human nature. Despite all the persecution Jewish people have faced throughout the centuries, Jewish people have also always thrived in many areas. Now, again, there are people who are Jewish who fail in life, who don't do well, obviously, but you oftentimes see Jewish people succeeding again in science and medicine and music and the arts, as I mentioned, in a lot of different areas. And why is that, people say? Well, a lot of that has to do with the teachings in the Jewish culture. Teachings of family and hard work and personal responsibility, and you read the ideas in Talmud and other things, and you follow those ideas of wisdom, and you're going to succeed. And instead of other people saying, hey, these are good ways of living your life, it's going to lead to success, people get jealous and envious. And I think that has sometimes led to Jew hatred. And then the last kind of point I want to mention is seen as outsiders. And this has been written about quite a bit, actually. That because the Jewish people never had a homeland again until 1948, which was their independent homeland, Jewish people were always a people who kind of held their traditions and customs very strongly, even without a state, right? Whether you're a Jewish person living in France, in the United States, in Germany, in anywhere, in Iraq, in the Middle East, you still held on to your Jewish culture very tightly. And so the other people are seeing them as outsiders. I mean, why do you hold on to your culture so tightly? Well, because our culture doesn't have a France, doesn't have a Germany, doesn't have a United States, doesn't have a nation, right? It took a long time for that to happen. And this is why the creation of the State of Israel again in 1948 is so important to understand in terms of how this leads to a new form of Jew hatred, which is anti-Zionism. And I want to explain what that word Zionism means and how there's this new form of Jew hatred that comes from that as well. And, I'm going to make that kind of clear and explain that in the next lecture. All right, so I hope that gives you a few things to think about. Again, there have been a lot of other things written about this and a little bit more detail, but I think at least gives you some basic idea of where I get this question a lot. These are the responses I usually give to students, and I thought it'd be good to put it together in one kind of brief lecture. All right, thank you. If you have any questions, let me know.